Give me 1 second. I'm a Mac user, so these computers are strange. These inferior machines, I can't help it. There we go. You see, it doesn't even like it because I use a Mac. Good morning, all of you. It's I need to stretch some more now after that, to getting started there. It's really thrilling to be with so many partners and friends. All of you, most of you in the room have been part of MenCare meetings along the way. Materials, the cause have inspired our work. We've cited you, we read your stuff and came up with MenCare from it. So I feel like I'm among colleagues who don't really need some of the things I'm going to offer. But we did think it was useful to start off with a moment of why are we doing MenCare? We launched it in 2011, and where did it come from and where do we think it's going? Okay, still trying to understand the computer. There we go. We're driven first and foremost as Promundo and Sonke as the co-coordinators of this with a gender justice origin. Our organizations come out of engaging men and boys and masculinities around achieving full gender equality. And although we looked at this topic for a long time, and many others as well, we kind of walked around fatherhood rather than looking right at how much this is such a key issue to the creation of the gender binary. Feminist authors and activists who inspired our work had been saying for a long time that the origin of the gender binary and gender inequality is at the origin of who does our daily caregiving. The fact that globally women and girls do 3 times the amount of it that boys and men do is perhaps the single biggest driver of gender inequality. We're not saying that our causes of gender-based violence, of reproductive health, of women's leadership, of other things that of course matter as well, but that this is really perhaps the heart of gender inequality. And I was reminded every once in a while when we think we're making it up, it's useful to go back and say, actually, we're on the shoulders of folks who had been thinking about this for a very long time. One of the feminist theorists in the 70s in the US who was talking about this has a book that she calls Sexual Arrangements and the Human Malaise, and her quote, which I thought was really good, it said, "When men start participating as deeply as women in the initiation of infants into the human estate, when both male and female partners come to carry, for all of us, the special meanings of early childhood, the trouble we have reconciling these meanings with personness will finally be faced." So in a sense, this shared caregiving, that's a bit heteronormative, we'll come back to that in a moment, about the importance of looking at diversity in this as well, but it does suggest to us just how much this unequal care divide is really why we do what we're doing. It's also important, I'll give you a little bit of tease for what we'll come out with tomorrow as the second State of the World's Fathers report, but that this goes hand in hand with social justice, with poverty alleviation, that also drives all of us here. It's not that equal caregiving gets rid of poverty, or it's not that poverty on its own ending poverty on its own will lead us to equal caregiving, but we can't do them without doing them together. What this data shows is that the care divide, the hours that women spend every day compared to men, are higher in the poorest countries of the world. In the poorest countries of the world, women do about 4 times the amount of the daily caregiving. In the richest countries of the world, that comes down to 2 times. No country in the world has achieved equality, but clearly poverty is a huge determinant of whether families have the adequate care, unpaid and otherwise, to care for their children. Achieving equality in caregiving is also associated with violence, whether we look at it at the household level or look at it at the societal level. This is data from our colleague Øystein Holter, analyzing data from Europe and from states in the United States. States and countries with less gender equality have higher rates of homicide. We see associations with use of violence at the household level as well. Whether we have equitable household decision-making, whether fathers are involved or men are involved in daily caregiving in more equitable ways, is also associated with reducing violence. It's also connected with happiness and well-being. This is also some of Øystein's data. We also have data from the Images survey showing that at the household level, and again, Øystein finds it at the country level, where there's more equitable household decision-making, where men do a greater share of the caregiving, women report that they're happier, and at the country level, looking at the happiest countries at the most equitable and the least equitable countries in Europe, there's a strong association with overall happiness ratings. So this is clearly about quality of life. It's about equality in general. It's about reducing poverty, and it's about reducing violence. So where did we start with MenCare in 2011? The first thing that drove us before we launched into this, we knew what could happen, what could go wrong in work on fatherhood. First, it could too quickly become kind of taken up by some of the fathers' rights groups. Fathers who are angry because they don't have custody, sometimes for justified reasons, but that anger didn't really turn into clear and useful messages and a kind of child-centered, right-centered approach that we wanted to take. We also wanted to make sure that it did speak to the children's rights issue, that it was also focused on that. And so we quickly reached out before we did anything, called it anything, came up with the principles. We reached out, and some of you were in the room, some are partners in your organizations, reached out to key partners in the women's rights field and the children's rights field to say, if you were to design this, what would it look like? And a couple of voices that stuck out with me. One who said, I'd be really disappointed if this was just about fathers. That it's too easy to make it about, we of course feel fantastic looking at these pictures of dads doing what we think dads should do and what we think men caregivers should be doing. But keeping it centered on gender equality, keeping it centered on policy, keeping it centered on supporting NGOs doing this work at the community level. Yes, feel good about those photos and our own personal stories of being involved as fathers, but keep it focused on the bigger gender equality picture. And the other one was to be really careful about this cultural specificity versus the universal. And kind of saying, you guys are going to step into a challenging journey here of trying to have some universal thoughts about fatherhood at the same time, but go for it and try it. And so we also felt that's been a tension and a challenge as well. How do we speak with some overall messages around this, as well as connecting and understanding the cultural specificity of it? So we pulled these out. Jane and I were dusting out some of these quotes from when we were doing this consultation in 2011 that we thought were quite useful to remind us of where we want to go with the campaign. We started modestly with an idea that we would have about 10 countries participating with us. We were thrilled when a couple of years later, and Nikki did the evaluation of that, when a few years later so many organizations joined us at the table. Certainly Save the Children there from the very beginning, the Men Engage Alliance, our partners at Rutgers, part of the first steering committee, and really have been the drivers of keeping all of this going. I tried to do a slide that mentioned all the partners over the years, but I couldn't find a font that was small enough so that it would all fit on a slide. So I won't name all of you, but really this has been a labor that's been collective, and want to acknowledge that we kind of lost count of countries after about 40. But there are now more than 40 countries that we know of, and many others are using the materials. You've seen the amazing array of stuff that's coming out. Sorry, one of those got strangely scrambled there. But anyway, you certainly know, and we'll see some more of these. We've been thrilled to see just how much these ideas do echo and have relevance across the world. You'll hear more about our parental leave platform. It's been key to dialogue with our colleagues at Pepina. Pleased to see that Maria's here, who really have said anything less than full equality in paid leave for fathers and mothers and all caregivers is not equality. And so really keeping and building on and dialoguing with that activist approach to say that's what equality needs to look like around parental leave is one of our key strategies. Unpaid care in general, dialoguing a lot now. Nikki at Oxfam, colleagues at Concern Worldwide, other organizations that have as their focus poverty alleviation, saying we've got to look at what this means for the unpaid care divide for women. Partnerships with UN Women about this have been central as well, to say this has to be a key part of achieving full equality and support for women in their unpaid care work, but also achieving a full 50-50. And again, I'm not going to go into the long list there. Those are in the new State of the World's Fathers coming out tomorrow. You know that in 2015, we had the question that kept coming up, what do we know globally? Do we have some big numbers that tell us where men are in terms of daily caregiving? And so we came out with the first one in 2015, thrilled at the media attention that it got. Our communications team, Sonke's communications team, SAVE, UN, other partners really helped us get it out there. There's the number of regional and country reports. We're about to launch a regional Latin American one. The Russian one just came out. thrilled with how useful these have been for driving discussions at the global level and at the national level. Proud to say that in a few countries, this got sort of parental leave and particularly paternity leave unstuck. In Brazil, where Promundo started, we now have 20 days paid paternity leave, partly as a result, not everything we have and want there. Tatiana's shaking her head. Has it been rolled back since? It's still there. Depends on, there's all, yeah, we can talk more about the details of it, but it has helped us nudge the needle in telling us why the activism has to keep going. Just to offer some final reflections and kind of keep us centered on why we're here. A few words that to me need to be out there and remembered as we move ahead. One is we can't do this work without connecting it up to the greater social justice work that we are connected with. We can't expect men to do their caregiving. Women don't have the support to do the caregiving they need if we don't also talk about the basic conditions of income equality and income support. And I think that's easy to forget. We spent some time in the event up to this on manhood here in the Balkans talking about power and accountability. We've also got to talk about that. It is too easy as we invite men in the door that men can take over power that women have had a sense of autonomy in. And I think that is a really key one that we've got to keep in mind. Let us keep that focus on power imbalance and equality centered around this as well. It's also easy to forget the issue of diversity. We talk a lot about heterosexual families and two-parent families, but we've got to keep centered that we're talking about the array of caregiving. And it's the caregiving not only of biological fathers or adoptive fathers, but of men of caring for others in many other kinds of ways, whether it's our elder parents or those next to us. It's also about accountability to the children's rights field, the women's rights field, and for us as individuals, accountability to those in our lives that we owe care to. I have a thrilled moment to get to embarrass my daughter who's here, who over the years of, she once wrote me a Father's Day message that referred to Promundo as her older, more famous brother. Perhaps reminding my partner and I that we didn't stop to have another child so that she might have a sibling. But she's centered me in accountability of going, yeah, Dad, it's kind of cool you travel the world and talk about this stuff, but could we play Pretty Pretty Princess? Could you read a book to me? That stuff doesn't really matter to me if you're not accountable to the daily caregiving. So for that and keeping me centered, my dear daughter, thank you. This is also about partnership. We're doing this all together. We're thrilled that Promundo hosts the communications arsenal that we get all this stuff out, and I'm glad that Jane did a fantastic call out of our team who's been doing that, but this really is about partnership, so we're thrilled and want to bring that energy to the table as well. Evidence you'll hear about tomorrow, so I won't go into that. Scale and activism we're going to talk about a lot, and finally scale and access. Finally, the activism part. The sobering data that we have is just how slowly we are making progress on this. We are thrilled as NGOs who do this on a daily basis where we are and what we've been able to do in our small corners, but really we've got to look at the global picture of just how much we have to do. The ILO tells us that at this rate of progress, it'll be 75 years before we achieve equality in women's income compared to men's. That is far too slow. And I think that is why we are calling the new State of the World's Fathers Time for Action. We're, of course, all frightened by what's going on in terms of the rise of certain authoritarian and right-wing forces in the world, and so there's multiple reasons why this is a time for action, but that equality point has got to be what we drive ahead on. So I want to thank, she didn't thank herself because she's not allowed to, but I get to take a moment and say, Jane Cotto-Wallace was the first program officer that Promundo hired to work on MenCare, and she said yes, crazily, and she's still with us, and she's been a driving force together with Ruti, and of course our comms team and others who aren't here, many of the other folks in our office, together with the Sonke team as the co-chairs on this. So I want to give Jane a hand and say thank you.
Thanks, boss. All right. Give me one moment. talk amongst yourselves. It's too quiet in here. All right, I would now like to invite Nikki Vander Gog, who is the Director of Women's Rights and Gender Justice at Oxfam in Great Britain. Nikki is a Senior Fellow with us at Promundo. She has also been an independent consultant who worked on gender and development with a particular focus on girls and on men and gender equality. She co-authored the first ever State of the World's Fathers Report in 2015. Her latest book on men and feminism, is that right? That was the... You've done one since then, so this bio is actually outdated. Was her latest book on, her last book in 2014 on feminism and men. She's also co-authored the No Nonsense Guide to Women's Rights and 6 State of the World's Girls Reports from Plan International, including one on boys and gender equality. Nikki, can I kindly invite you to present?
Thank you very much, Jane. So it's really exciting to be here, seeing so many old friends and new ones as well. As Jane and Gary have said, I've been involved in this work for a while and was there at the last MenCare meeting in Cape Town. So it's just fantastic to see so many people back again, but also new faces and how the movement is spreading. I think one of the things that really struck me at the last MenCare conference was not only, as our esteemed speaker earlier on was saying, that so many men were there, because so many of us women go to gender meetings where there are very few men, but actually that so much of the work was being driven by women's organizations, that the people the women that women's organizations were working with are saying, please work with men, please work on this issue. So, it's driven by very dedicated organizations and men in those organizations, but it's also driven by women. So what Gary and Jane have asked me to do today is just give a little bit of the context in terms of women's rights and women's economic empowerment. So I want to start with a very brief reminder. Now, tell me how to do this. Do I just... Yes, I'm making funny noises here. A very brief reminder of the context of women's empowerment in the economy. So across the world, women consistently earn less than men and are concentrated in the lowest paid and least secure forms of work. Globally, the average gender pay gap is still 23%. There are 700 fewer women than men in paid work, and women do 2 to 10 times more unpaid care. As Gary was saying earlier, it varies so much across countries. Gary talked about 75 years, I think, from the ILO in terms of that gap. The World Economic Forum last year actually said that it was getting worse, that it's now at 170 years. So I don't know what statistics different people are picking up, but that includes not just the gender pay gap, but all the different measures that you can have around women's economic employment. Women still make up the majority of the poorest in the world, and Gary's already talked about violence. As that's one thing that hasn't changed in my lifetime, or probably since my grandmother's lifetime. Really, really shocking. And we know there are links there with the unpaid care work too. So it's important to remember that unpaid care is just part of that picture, but an important part. And that we are talking about unpaid men doing unpaid care, freeing up women to do paid work. But there is a bigger picture to that, and that's about reframing the economy. Evidence shows that although gender equality supports economic growth, not all economic growth supports gender equality. And our extreme economic model is concentrating wealth at the top of the economy. Oxfam's just done some research that shows that currently 8 men, and I say men advisedly, own as much as the poorest 3.6 billion people on the planet. So Gary's right to put it in the context of poverty and of inequality, and we really need to remember that as well. You'll see on tomorrow, when the next report is launched, that it talks very clearly about individual change, but it also talks about structural change in economic, social and political arenas. And I think very often in lots of gender work that's forgotten, that we don't make that connection between the laws that are out there and the way that we want to change our lives as individuals. So I think making that link is incredibly important. And it's on those levels, individual, institutional, structural, that we really need to change. Then I just wanted to look a bit at the kind of context of power. There's been some really interesting work about men's contradictory experiences of power. I think, there used to be a time when everybody was assuming that all women were the same. There's also the danger of assuming that all men are the same. And actually we know that they're not, and that men's experiences of power are contradictory. But we also know that there's a very active men's rights movement in many different parts of the world. And in many countries, men don't do any unpaid work, but they also don't let women go out to work, for example. Research in 67 developing countries revealed that on average 1 in 5 men disagreed that women should be able to work outside the home. And in Images researchers looked at this as well. A poll by the Pew Research Centre in, I'm trying to remember how many different countries, but I think quite a few, showed that when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job. 84% of respondents in Russia agreed. 84% of respondents, Russia, in India agreed, 51% in Lebanon, 49% in Russia, 41% in Brazil, 14% in the USA, and 12% in Britain and Spain. So, this isn't a north-south divide, although it's worse in some countries in the south. It's something that's still there very strongly in many parts of the world. And it just shows how important the work of MenCare is. There is still such a long way to go. So what does it mean for women? And what do women want men to do in the home? I think the first and most important thing is that we value unpaid care. And until we value unpaid care equally to paid work, things aren't going to change. And men are a really important part of making that change happen, of making sure that unpaid care is as valued as paid care in the economy and outside it. Oxfam's done quite a lot of research on unpaid care in a number of different countries in a programme called We Care that my colleague Anam Parvez is going to be talking about on Saturday. And we asked women, I think I've got another slide here, yes. We asked women what tasks they wanted men to do. And it was quite interesting. So 80% wanted their husbands to be more involved in care activities. But they were very clear about what. So water collection, childcare, fuel collection, elder care and community care, clothes preparation, meal preparation, and cleaning. So they were they knew what they needed support on. But it's not just about support. I think there was very recently this wonderful cartoonist called, a French cartoonist called Emma, who did a cartoon around unpaid care. And she talked about what feminists call the mental load. And I suspect most women, and maybe some men in this room will recognise this. So it's not just about men helping. It's actually about a 50-50 share. I'm not going to read this out because hopefully you can read it for yourself. I was very proud of myself that I could manage to take screenshots and then put them onto the PowerPoint. So I'm feeling very, advanced technologically. But, mental load is still almost completely borne by women. And again, for the We Care programme, we found in Zimbabwe that the women we surveyed were doing 5 or 6 hours of unpaid care and domestic work a day. But they had 13 hours of care responsibility. So, for example, you're doing the washing up, but you're also holding the baby, you're also planning the meal, you're also thinking about all the other things that need to be done. So that I think when we're thinking about unpaid care, it's not just about the nice bits. It's also about cleaning the toilet, but it's also about thinking about and planning. And who sends in this country, who sends a birthday cards? Who buys the presents for the grandmothers? Who does all that kind of planning work? Really important to remember that when we think about unpaid care. And finally, as Gary's pointed out, The work on unpaid care, the feminist work on unpaid care is not new. It goes back to the 1970s probably. But then the women in the global south have been raising it as an issue for many years as well. Wages for housework was a big campaign in the 1970s too. So we need to recognize the history of that work. We need to build these debates from the bottom up and the top down, and we need to involve women as well as men. And I think MenCare has been very careful from the start to try and do that. And it's really important, while we work to increase men's involvement in care work at home, we don't do it in a way that shrinks women's autonomy. And we also address the economic and gender norms that expand their autonomy in other areas outside care work. In many countries, the home is the only place where women have power, where women have control. We need to be very careful in doing this work, not to just push men into the home and push women out of the only place where they feel safe and respected. So I'm just going to finish with 3 short quotes from some of the women from our program. From Uganda, this is echoed in a lot of the MenCare programs too, about the changes that women see. She said, "I had the most disorganized family because of heavy care work. The change agent came and talked to me with my husband. My husband understood the message and joined the drama group. This has changed him. He never used to do any work at home, but now when I'm away, he prepares food for the children, he bathes them, and he does other work. I am happy." So, you know, you've all seen changes on an individual level that can happen. I think some of those changes, we talk about, you know, the redistribution of care work and the recognition of care work. I think there's also how about the reduction. So I've been doing some work looking at the kind of technology that can help women and introducing, for example, more efficient stoves. So Vidalina Munoz from Colombia said she realized she was spending 8 hours a day on non-paid care work and 7 hours in the family nursery business and selling fruit. So she had this new stove, but also there was work with her husband. So she said, "In the morning, my husband makes the coffee and brings it to me in the nursery. Now we compete for kitchen duties. Sometimes he makes breakfast or dinner, and sometimes I do it when I'm not too busy with my business. He's not hesitant anymore to get close to the stove. Before, he'd never make dinner because he was arriving home very tired, and cooking on the old stove was a hassle. But with the new stove, it's really easy, and he cooks dinner now." So that bit of it might be worth thinking about a bit more in terms of our work. And finally, Kitarbe Tefe from Ethiopia said, "Now I've taken part in We Care, there's more discussion within the house between my husband and me. We discuss things, we support each other, and I also do this with my peer group. My husband stopped asking me where I am all the time. He knows I'm working on the farm. If he asks me for money, I can now ask why he wants it. If it's not something from the house, I can say no." So if we can put in that piece around empowering women as well as getting men more involved in the house, then I think we will have cracked it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nikki, for helping us to further frame this discussion on men's caregiving around accountability to women's rights groups, the complex power dynamics and gender relations, and other factors that you highlighted there. Next, I would like to invite Nigina Bazed, who is the Regional Technical Advisor on Gender at the UNFPA Eastern Europe Central Asia Regional Office in Istanbul. Dr. Nigina has worked to promote women's rights, development, and human rights for the past 15 years in the areas of research and program management. She joined the UNFPA in 2005 and has served in Azerbaijan, Afghanistan, and now the regional office that covers 17 countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia and the Central Asia region. She has worked closely with government, policymakers, parliamentarians, NGOs, and leaders from all sectors to champion women and girls' rights, including in humanitarian and emergency settings. Nigina will help to further situate us within the Eastern Europe and Central Asia context, including in the Balkans, where we are going to be talking about men and caregiving. Nigina, may I ask you to kindly present? Is it this one? Yeah, this one's actually
Thanks a lot, Jane, and thanks a lot, dear colleagues. It's my pleasure to be here. It's nice to see familiar faces and some new faces also, as also Nikki said and Gary. So I will zoom a little bit on the Eastern Europe, Central Asia regional, Central Asia countries. But what I will say, I understand will be, and I guess will be quite similar to what you experience in other parts of the world. A little bit about the region and a little bit about the office that we cover. We cover 17 countries and we have 2 offices, one in Istanbul and one in Almaty. And 17 countries are those which are mainly coming from the Eastern Europe and Central Asia, as I said, and majority of them inherited the Soviet, structure, post-Soviet countries. So many of them went through the transition period. We work with Promundo and with other partners for many years, and these are just a couple of publications that on the global level that has been done. And I just wanted to present to you that we cover many issues, and both on the regional and country level and global level, so you are aware of the work. So more to the context. The regional context I wanted to highlight is that we have tremendous social, cultural, and political diversity in this region. But one thing that is very much the common factor for all countries is the set of stereotyped gender norms that define behavior, values, and attitudes. So as the regional office, we do observe and we monitor carefully the regional trends. And one of the very concerning trends that we now observe is the uprising conservative politics, retraditionalization, and stereotype social norms in this region. So it's very strongly coming up. It's very much ties women to the primary value only to the reproductive function, maternal care, and private sphere of home, and that has huge impact on women's rights, but also on men as well. So in this region, we have one specific, the characteristic which is very much common to all countries is the generous maternity leave provisions. In majority of the countries, we have up to 3 and more years of maternity leave, and very little for paternity leave. In some countries, it's just several days, like in Turkey, and in other countries, it's just a few weeks. So in this respect, women and men are very much disadvantaged. Also, cuts to the consequences of the economic crisis pushed to cuts in social services, freezing in social assistance programs. That leads to growing reliance on families and on unpaid labor. So now again, women are put on spot to take care of the, to basically compensate of ongoing economic crisis, and they are the ones who gonna take all the burden for that. So, and I will come back to that later as well. Weak support of the private sector. The sector, most of the companies, they do not really realize value of how they can get or benefit from engaging men, and what might be the overall benefit for the companies in terms of employment, efficiency, and other things. So we see the lost opportunities for women, but we also see very strong feminization of poverty among elderly women, because they are obviously not exposed to the labor opportunities, so they are accumulating much less entitlements than men, and they live longer in this region, but they suffer from a lot of chronic diseases, and they also suffer from very high level of poverty comparing to men, because they're breadwinners. They die earlier, so they lose all their financial support. So this fertility decline is the argument that is used very strongly now in this region, and I want specifically address that, because when we look at the data, we know that women in this region, and they have aspirations to have 2 kids. And so this is their fertility intentions. But they don't go for that. They go to 1 And this is that we come to aggravated fertility, which means that in between those, when you have desire and actual fertility, you have barriers that stop women, that put women into dilemma between motherhood and their career aspirations. In this region, women are very highly educated, so they have high career attainments. They have their high career accomplishment goals. So that puts women into dilemma. Should they have children or should they go for the career? So that's very strongly coming up. And this is, now we're talking about, in number of countries in that region, we're talking about demographic security, using the argument of declining fertility as argument to boost fertility, to push women back into the reproductive health function only, and to limit space for them. And we make it as a threat. I mean the governments mainly, they make it as a threat to use that and to promote the populist agenda, to promote pronatalist policies, which are very strongly coming up now in this region. So impact on women, obviously I touched upon some of them already, so it's strict gender division of labor and the household level. Women's role is limited only to reproductive function. Also what we see, the situation with the social care and the economic crisis, also putting the additional burden on women and fixing the problem at the expense of women's rights. It's very convenient fix for the states also. So they don't need to invest, they just put women, they make them responsible for care, and then they don't need to invest into that. And I give you one example that was recently introduced, promoted as the good measure, for instance, in Turkey, when the government was saying about that we will introduce now programs about to support women, working women, but what is that? This is about paying a little bit incentive to grandmothers to take care of the child. So, this is like, just as I said, like temporary measures, convenient fix of at the expense of women's rights, basically. Double burden is increasing, and as I said, dilemma between motherhood and career is strongly coming up. This is the data that we got from number of studies, and basically it demonstrates that none of the countries actually achieved any kind of equal pay, equal share. In terms of the impact on men, equally, paternal roles are restricted very strongly. We're talking about the fatherhood as a status. We do not talk about fatherhood as a parental behavior. So that obviously restricts men in terms of the connecting to children, and lost opportunities for men in terms of establishing father-child connections, learning from each other's experience. It has impact on psychological health of men, and children are raised. The new generation is raised with very strong gender stereotypes as well. This is the data that we got from number of images that we did in the countries, and number of countries. So this shows that the percentage of fathers who are engaged in one or more activities, and basically those activities are reading books, telling stories, singing songs to child, taking the child outside of the home, playing with the child, on spending time. So we see some development, so we take this as the highlight for positive entry points to promote early child fatherhood and male involvement, but we also see that majority of those activities which men are engaged are not laborious, or labor intensive actions, like a little bit playing, but not cooking for the child, not feeding, not bathing, this kind of things. So because of this conservative trend, sometimes male involvement is the only entry point for us to come into to promote gender equality. So we use it very, very as a strong argument in conservative environment. When we talk with the conservative governments and stakeholders, we use it as one of the strong entry points, because somehow it's not so strongly objected, but when we talk about women's rights, it becomes, especially reproductive rights, we face very strong resistance. This is the example that I want to show, is the regional platform that embrace number of organizations that we established, and you are all welcome to join it. And this platform is focusing on working with men and boys and promote involvement of men and boys on different levels. We will have a couple of examples during the upcoming days. So I was asked also to look at the prospects. What are the way we can be? What are entry points that we could use in the upcoming 5 or 10 years to promote male involvement and change the situation about unpaid care? So what I see, or what we see as the opportunities, is that as an opportunities, one of them is that coming strongly that from images that young generations are more prone to change. Now we see that even that the unpaid care is mainly it is taken as mainly as the women's responsibility. An interesting trend shows that younger couples, like in the age of 18-24 and younger men specifically, who are more educated, they are more prone to get involved in the child care. So if we do a joint advocacy around that, we might make some changes. Also, the two-income model family is also one of the entry points to be considered. Because in the industrialized society, more and more families move to two-income family model, and because it's not enough anymore in this economic crisis to be sustained only on one income, and we also see it as the opportunity for engaging men back more into the unpaid care. The modern technology is another area that could be also taken as the entry point for us, because now the modern technology will allow a new modality of work. So men might have combined their work and life balance, and work and life balance in more flexible way, and that could be used as well. Crucial role of private sector, I mentioned about that. That's also important to bring private sector, and we will have good example of work on that from ACEF in the upcoming years. Social media role is one of the also important entry points. And engaging men as allies for SRH needs, for sexual reproductive needs. This is important entry point because, as we say, it's parenthood and the pregnancy period is a very emotional period for men as well. So how we use that specific, how we make the connection to that specific period of time and bring men to the antenatal care, to antenatal visits and further fatherhood. Migration is another thing that we have to consider, and transborder travel of social norms. And this is interesting because we see countries with the high female migration, but also with high male migration, but also with high female migration. In countries with high male migration, we see very strong reconstruction of gender norms, because men are, again, promoted as a breadwinner more and more. But where the female migration is high, women are taking role of breadwinner, and men are staying behind to take care of the children. So here there's the clash of the norms, and sometimes it even increased the violence, domestic violence, but also it's transformed the notions, and also migration between countries. So when people migrate, they bring their norms with them. So then they promote those norms in the communities that they are basically integrating. So that's interesting to consider. And last point is political leadership. I started from that, and I'm gonna complete with that because that's important thing to consider. And for me, the question is that how we deal with not democratic governments which come by democratic way, so based on the populist agenda. So I really have to think, we have to think on how we move not only grassroots level, but also how we move to the policy level on that. So thank you very much, and it's my pleasure to be here.
So hello? Can you hear me? Hello? Okay. We have about 8 minutes before we go to coffee break. So I think we have time for maybe 2 questions. I think we have another roving mic somewhere. So if I can ask 2 people who would like to ask a question of our 3 presenters here. And then, yeah, that would be great. The floor is yours. No one has questions. Okay. Yes. Right there to Elena, please. Thank you.
I have a question for Nikki about that data. What was about this work, and what was the research when you showed this data about when job is not like a very high unemployment, then the job is better given for men, not women. The slide one, sorry. I just need to, when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. To whom was the question given, and what was the respondents? And this, yeah, I think.
Let's take one more question. Thank you, Elena. Okay, from Maria. Great.
Yeah, I wish we knew if these people, regarding to that question, these people were asked the other way around, because in this question is tricky. This is my opinion. I don't know what you can say about that. You know, if the question was, would you think that the jobs should be offered to both women and men in the same terms? Yeah.
All right. I'm being told that those 2 questions actually are quite interlinked and can be answered in one response. So let's take one more question. Yes, we have one over there. One more, Sunan.
Hi. I'm just going to reiterate something Nikki said, but if all of you could give a few quick, maybe words in the matter of time, that would be great. Nikki ended her talk by saying we should just be very careful in making sure that we don't push men necessarily home and make women more unsafe about the only place that they're feeling safe. Coming from a region, just as Nigina, where that is the case definitely in our region, can you, like, would it be easy for you to just give a few quick examples of how we should be careful about that? Thanks.
Perfect. So, Nikki, there was a direct question to you about what was the research that you used around when jobs are scarce, who kind of gets the employment, and then to all 3 of you, how do we keep in mind that we need to be careful about pushing women out from spaces where they feel like they do have power, to ensure that we're not causing unintentionally harm to individuals. So, Nikki, maybe you start, and then we'll kind of go down the line. Use this one.
Okay, thank you for those questions. So the very specific one, the research was done not by us, but by the Pew Research Center, PEW, based in the US, in 7 different countries. And the question was, when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job. And I absolutely agree with you. It would be really interesting to ask that question differently, but that's how they asked it. So I can send you both the link to the research if you'd be interested, or we could actually send it out as part of the kind of package. But I mean, there's so many other interesting questions that could be asked, can't there? And different pieces of research are doing different sorts of questions. And I think maybe reframing some of it could be some of the kind of the work that MenCare does as well. I think Summer's question's a really good one, and I'm sure my colleagues will answer it too. I think it's a really difficult one as well, because we're kind of negotiating. I'm going to talk a bit on Saturday about social norms. We're really negotiating with, in people's very private spaces. And, you have to be respectful of the context, you have to be respectful of the culture, and we know that this work takes generations as well. It's not going to happen, overnight. So really thinking about, well, in that particular, not just in that country, but in that village, what are the kind of ways that people view this? How can it be negotiated? The 3 quotes I showed at the end were kind of a result of a process of negotiating between the husband and the wife about what was possible and what wasn't possible. And I think that's the most important thing. So we listen to what women have to say, we negotiate, and that men are respectful of what women want, but also that, we work with young men and young women, as many people in this room are doing, to think about how you can build it through the new generation. So that would be my response to that. Gary?
I'll comment first on the Pew question. We've used that same question in the Images survey. And one reason we ask it that way, when we do ask do you think both men and women should have jobs, you often get a 95% saying yes, in kind of a political correct. When we do qualitative research, what we hear is, well, he makes more money. If jobs are scarce, it's more important that he works because of that reality that we reinforce that men's income are higher, therefore we want him to keep working. And women will sometimes say, we know what happens if he's out of work, whether that turns into violence, his drinking, So, women as part of a patriarchy as well that says we see what this does when men don't have work, we see the harm, and women internalizing these gender inequitable norms. So it's an imprecise question, but we do think it gets a lot at how the gender inequitable ideas are, of course, internalized by women as well as by men. So I do think while it is worded in a slightly negative and maybe even leading way, it does give us a sense of how far we are still from equality as an aspiration in women's lives and achieving it as a reality in women's lives as well. On the question of being careful about the power, I think it is something that we build in, and we'll hear from some of our program work, that we build in as how we assess impact on programs, is listening qualitatively and quantitatively of what do women say about men engaging in tasks that in some settings they haven't done before. So I think it is that constant listening. It does point to the importance of what a lot of us in the room do, which is father and parent discussion groups, that in parts of the world where this is new, or couples that are starting their childbearing, for example, that these things need to be in dialogue. Many of us do that anyway, but we can always be helped by a space where we do more of it. And I think we also have to touch on a thorny issue, which is that women are often the gatekeepers for men's involvement. And it's both an issue of power, and it's also an issue of women accepting men's first steps into these places where we haven't done these things before. And it's far too easy sometimes for us as men to step back and say, well, she says I don't do it the way that she does it, so I'm just going to step back and not do any of the nappy changing or whatever. I can talk about some personal experiences of how it's easy to, with female partner, the mother-in-law, whoever, kind of telling us men that we're incompetent at this work, and it's easy for us to stay on the sidelines. So it is a delicate dance. How do we engage women as part of the discussion of saying we've got to let men get their hands, dirty into this work, so to speak, and we've got to be really, really careful about the power issues all at the same time. And that's why we're trying to figure out how to live together in the household and hold these power dimensions in our heads, right? So it's a complicated one. And I think it does, I agree with Nikki, it sounds easy when we put it on PowerPoint, like, yeah, guys should do this, but it does require a real sensitivity to those issues.
Probably I will add just in relation to the second question. I do agree with both Nikki and Gary that it's issue of power, but because for many women, home is considered to be the only space where they have a little bit power. So, in some societies, in some communities, women's mobility even restricted, so they have very little space to realize themselves outside of the family. So sometimes they do protect that space, and that they don't want men to be fully engaged, you know, and so because they consider that their own, you know, only power area. And also role of the social pressure, I think it's very important. Even sometimes even men really want to be, you know, to do that roles, but they have such significant and strong pressure from both the extended family members, but also from the society, even men and women equally. So that's, I think, also puts a lot of pressure in that respect. And what we also have to consider in terms of the violence, because yes, when there is a transformation of norms and this clash of the values, you know, and the very strong norms, that brings to the conflict. So we may observe actual uprise of domestic violence in those cases, and we have to be aware of that. So we have to make it in very delicate way, so it doesn't go into the level of violence and extreme way of behavior. Yes.
Thank you all to our three panelists. Can we give them one final round of applause, please? It is, for those of you who have been in a training with me, I'm very strict with time, so it's killing me that we're 30 minutes behind. So it's 11 o'clock. We'll take a tea break until 11:30, okay? During your tea break, if I could kindly ask you to check out the summaries that are in your folder for MenCare around the world. After the tea break, we will be having presenters hosting individual tables in this room, and you will have the opportunity to hear from 4 different initiatives from around the world. So if you could just take a few minutes during your tea break to look at the different presentations that will be highlighted here, and then come back ready to know which tables you're going to visit, that would be fantastic. So thank you all so much. We'll see you in 30 minutes. Thanks.